Good time of the day, everybody. How are you all? It's nice to be here with you again for the third in our series of webinars on DSI. In what have we been? 6 days, I think. It's been very busy, but it's been brilliant to be with you all and to present all this information. And it's great to be here again. Not long to go now, of course, until COP. I'm sure you're all very busy making your final preparations, and we're all very much looking forward to it. We are very, very pleased today to be joined by the co-chairs of the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization. They will introduce themselves in a moment, but we're incredibly grateful that they're here. They've been really, really important to our process, and it's great that they're going to be able to talk to you directly today. We are going to talk indeed about their work, and in particular the third meeting of the Advisory Committee, which took place just after the meeting of the working group which we had in Montreal. Before I hand over to them and ask them to talk you through some very important material, let me just quickly hand over to the Secretariat, who will remind us about some housekeeping. Kirsty, over to you.
Thank you, Will, and good time of day to everyone. So as usual, our standard housekeeping rules apply. So the webinar is recorded and similar to the previous two will be published online. You'll find the previous two are already on the website you can see on the screen now. Today we will be conducting in English only, and we have allowed time at the end for Q&A. So as previously, you're not able to unmute just yet, but if you post any questions in the chat, and then when we get to the Q&A section, you'll be unmuted as well. With that, I think I will be handing over to Patrick to start the substance of the meeting. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much to our Secretariat colleagues for organizing this, and of course, thanks Will and Fatso for inviting us to join. I think I speak also for Ines when I say that we feel like we are now guests to a very important talk show, participating in your series of webinars on DSI. And as you rightly pointed out, Will, we're here to talk a little bit about the work that we did in ACRM 3, which is a meeting that we had in Montreal not too long ago. That was August. But perhaps before jumping into specifically that meeting, I just wanted to remind participants what the ACRM is, our Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization. That is a committee that was established by COP15, of course, to work intersessionally towards COP16. And we have been given by COP15 three main tasks. One, we had to propose some updates for the resource mobilization strategy of the convention so that we can update it with the Global Biodiversity Framework. Two, we needed to do an exploration of the global biodiversity finance landscape. And then we were given a mandate that relates to DSI, where we basically had to discuss whether and how the GEF, a global biodiversity fund, or another alternative would be the adequate entity to receive and disburse the revenue generated by DSI. Our ACRM met 3 times, as I said, and in the first 2 times that we met, and that was in Kinshasa and then afterwards in Villa de Leyva in Colombia, we basically focused on the first 2 questions that we were given, or the 2 main tasks. And that was for a reason, because we thought as a committee, we could not really discuss which would be the adequate entity to receive and to disperse the revenue generated by DSI before, of course, the working group on DSI finalized its work to the extent possible to give us some material to have this conversation from a resource mobilization perspective. So, which is why we basically met back to back from your meeting in August when you concluded. And our starting point then in Montreal was the document that you guys prepared, and you obviously know it already, so I don't have to describe your document to you, but you know that it contains a set of options. Of course, we have this big option that we're talking when it comes to the disbursement method, if we're going to go through a project allocation disbursement modality, or if we're going to go through direct allocation disbursement modalities. But there are other options that are reflected in the document in terms of brackets. For instance, also in the disbursement side, if, for instance, we are also going to be dispersing the revenue to indigenous communities or indigenous peoples in developed countries or only developing ones, that's also like a point that's on the table. But also when we move towards the contribution side of the equation, there are choices to be made in terms of how are we going to be collecting this money? Is it going to be directly from the industry, or is it going to be channeled through the national government and then sent to a specific fund? Is it going to be mandatory? Is it going to be voluntary? So there are a number of options that are left open in the DSI document. So what we did, of course, in ACRM 3, and this is, I think, the first very important point that I wanted to flag. We did, of course, not choose between the options that are on the table, because that is not our job. That's going to be the COP's job to decide which of the options we are going to go every time we have to make a decision regarding those specific aspects. But what we did was some sort of conditional exercise in trying to say, if you guys make this option for contributions, if you guys make this option for disbursements, these are the things that the entity receiving and dispersing the revenue generated from DSI would need to have. These are the requirements. These are the criteria that this entity would need to have. So we were looking into your options from a resource mobilization perspective to further sophisticate the conversation that will need to be had in COP16. So again, our job was not to choose between the options that had been prepared by the DSI working group, but simply to reflect on the institutional arrangements that would be needed if the COP were to decide for each of these options or even for a hybrid one. Then what we did, of course, in ACRM 3 was also structure our conversation having in mind the three avenues that are included in our mandate or reflected in our mandate as potential solutions to this question. Because what we have been asked by COP16 is to reflect, or by COP15 is to reflect whether the GEF, through its GBFF or not, could be performing this function, or a new global biodiversity finance instrument could be performing this function, or another alternative. So we have to first identify some criteria, which my co-chair Ines is going to present to you in detail in a minute. She's going to say, look, when we look at the options that have been provided by the DSI community, we identify some general criteria that this fund might need to have, some criteria addressing the possibilities for contribution, some criteria identifying the possibilities for disbursement. And then we started looking into how the three alternatives, the three avenues related to these kind of criteria. I believe that, and this is a spoiler to an important part of Ines' presentation, and this will be my last point before I hand over the floor to her, a preliminary conclusion that we have arrived in the ACRM 3, or perhaps I should say that was like a guiding principle of our work, is the notion that form should follow function. Basically, what we were trying to say with that is the notion that first COP should decide how it wants the funds to be received and to be dispersed. And sequentially, we should address the issue of identifying which of the funds that are already existing or potentially a new one should be created to be performing this function. I think when you look at this mantra or this principle from the other angle, what we're trying to also say is that the question on which fund should be used to receive and disperse DSI should not be seen as a limitation or a precondition for the conversation on how the funds are going to be received and dispersed. This is an important question that the COP will need to explore under its DSI agenda item, and then you can deal with the issue sequentially with the issue of which fund would be identified for that purpose. So with that, I would like to hand over directly the floor to my fellow co-chair Ines, so that she can go into a little bit more detail into the criteria that we have identified as ACRM.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks for the introduction. I think you already covered quite some ground. I would like to take people back to where we were in Montreal. I would believe that most participants to this webinar are very familiar with the DSI issues. And that was not necessarily the case for the ACRM. So for both Patrick and me, it's been quite a steep learning curve, and even more so for our participants in the ACRM who has not been involved in DSI. Luckily, we had some DSI knowledgeable people, but still, it was quite a tough job to get our head around what would be necessary. It's not an easy question to answer. What would work as a host for a DSI fund if you don't really understand the intricacies of DSI? So basically, the first day we spent trying to translate what came out of the DSI open-ended working group into what we could match on the resource mobilization language and a fund. And we understood that the best way to do that is, as Patrick said, is by lifting out the criteria that a fund would have to comply with based on the choices that the COP may make. And maybe, Christine, I can ask you to go to the slide 4. Yeah, that one, thank you. So, as Patrick said, we identified general criteria and then more contribution-oriented criteria and more disbursement-oriented criteria. And I think, as most of you will know, a lot of the material that's in the DSI document that is sent to COP now is based on criteria that were already identified in COP15 Decision 9. So we try to really map that out first before starting to look at what kind of host could deal with this. So therefore, what we realized is for the general criteria, we need to deal with the ones that are on your screen. So fair, equitable, transparent, accountable, and gender responsive, under the authority and guidance of and accountable to the COP, have a governance structure that is decided by the COP. Of course, as Patrick already said, have the full and effective participation of IPLCs, not just in the governance of the fund, but also make sure that there's robust social safeguards to respect their rights, have cost-efficient, effective, timely operations, and then have the ability to receive and disburse funding soon after the decision of the COP16. That is something that is quite important. It's the timely aspect. And then the ability to interact with other relevant processes, because we know there's quite a lot of movement in the DSI landscape beyond CBD as well. So these general criteria were the bottom line, basically, that we lifted out of the document, both of the DSI Working Group 2 and 59. And if I can ask you to go to the next slide. But then, of course, there are very specific criteria that are linked to the choices to be made by COP on how the funds will be received by any fund. And that is quite important to understand, that the way these funds are generated, whether it comes directly in small amounts from multiple actors in the private sector, or whether it is channeled through national governments, or whether it's mandatory or voluntary, that all has different requirements for a fund. Some funds can handle that, some funds can't. Some funds will need to have adjustments to be able to receive a lot of small contributions, which are not coming from countries. So all of this needed to be translated into what it would mean for a fund. So those are the criteria you see on your screen. So it's to receive contribution from private sector. And then also what is then the requirement for the private sector, that this process should be simple and effective, which also is something that then will have to be matched on the kind of fund that would be able to do that does not have very heavy contribution processes. It also would have to be able to issue receipts and certificates, amounts from a large number, receive revenue from the use of DSI without an international obligation, which is also something that is now more standard, that most of the contributions to a fund are based on obligations, have the ability to receive payments based on national legislation, or have additional or voluntary contribution without any legal obligation. So we hope that we got those criteria right out of the document, and that it will also be captured then in the decision by COP, but that's for the contribution. And then we go to the next one, which are for the disbursement, which also has a lot of specificities based on what COP may decide. There are options in the text already that would require a fund to be able to disburse to developing countries and to developed countries, to operate on project-based or through direct allocation, which is the option A and B in the document. Again, apply a simple and effective process to disburse funds. Do not require co-financing. Provide direct access to IPLCs and direct access to IPLCs in developed countries. What we expect is that whatever COP decides will be a combination of different general criteria, disbursement criteria, and contribution criteria. So what we did then is take a look at the potential hosts that could handle these criteria based on, as Patrick just showed, the mandate that the ACRM has. So, Christy, if you can go to the next slide. Basically, we've been asked to look at whether or not the GEF could handle this DSI fund hosting, or the Global Instrument for Biodiversity Finance as required by COP15, or any other option. And there we were focused mainly on UN funding institutions because of what we know. We know that there's funds that have been hosted by the CBD Secretariat. There are the multi-partnership trust funds, and there are also others that could serve as an example, like, for example, the Montreal Protocol, which with its multilateral fund, or even the benefit sharing mechanism under the international treaty. So I'll briefly go through the three that we identified as the most directly relevant. So if you can go to the next slide, which is about the GEF. There we made a distinction between either using the existing GBFF to create a new program, which has advantages also to be operationalized very quickly, but there are some restrictions also on how it can function. And as you can see on the screen, I'm not going to read it all out, but the details are very much present in our report, which is available, by the way, on the COP16 website, because it's more nuanced than what's on the screen. But of course, this gives you a summary of how the ACRM concluded on the option of a GBFF new program. And then also the other option is, of course, to create a new fund within the GEF family, which could be more adjusted to the DSI needs, but of course it would also have drawbacks on more costs or further fragmentation, etc. So then I will not spend too much time on the next two slides, but we'll just show them to you. It's how the GBFF would respond to the general criteria and the contribution criteria. Again, this is a summary of the report. The report really has a lot of information, and I would invite you all to take a look at it. Our point today is mainly to make you understand or make it clear why we are working with criteria and why we are not pointing out one or the other fund. So I invite you to very much look at, I see Usman is putting the link in the chat, so that's where you can find the document. So if I can ask you to go to the next slide. As I said, we had the chance to have the GEF present in this ACRM, and there was a lot of information shared that addressed each one of the criteria that we just showed you. So that was very useful, and it gives you a very good idea of what the GEF cannot, whether the GBFF or the GEF itself, and it gives you also a good idea of what would be the requirements and the options to go with that option. If you go to the next slide. Okay. This is based on, so the slide is wrong. It shouldn't say via the JEF. That has nothing to do there. So I would like Secretariat to remove that one after we finish the slides. But this Global Instrument for Biodiversity Finance is actually a requirement by the COP15, which has asked the ACRM to look at this and which will be discussed at COP16. Of course, this doesn't exist yet. And whether or not this will be further discussed and developed is also a choice to be taken by the COP. So this is something that is not existing yet, but could theoretically be designed in such a way that it would meet all the criteria. It wasn't the ACRM mandate to consider this one, which was a bit difficult because it has no criteria of its own yet, but there are ways of already looking at what it may be, because there is an annex in the document, the SBI 4 document, which is sent to COP, which contains a placeholder looking at this, and where this also the relationship with the DSI decision is connected. So this was added by the ACRM for completeness, because we are asked to look at this, and also because it may come into play depending on what the COP decides on this potential new fund. Then if I can go to the next slide, and that is about the other set of instruments we looked at. That's within the context of the UN. And we were also lucky to have a presentation by somebody from the Multi-Partnership Trust Fund Office to address some of the criteria. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to the same detail because timing was very tight right after the open-ended working group of DSI to really get all that information from a lot of instruments. Luckily for us, the JEF was present in the DSI workshop and open-ended working group, so that was an advantage, but we did not get the same level of detail on information. So the information we have in the report is more fragmented on the other potential funds. And therefore also the ACRM basically identified that we need more information before COP16, because COP16 would need to know more in detail how these funds would respond to each one of the criteria. And we hope that we will still be able to receive that before the COP. But basically we identified two big tracks. One is as you can see, the Multi-Partnership Trust Fund. And for example, the convene fund, Biodiversity Fund, which is from the Chinese co-presidency, who basically has now started that under the MPTF. And it is also a way of having funds function very quickly. There are certain criteria that will need to be looked at more in detail, but normally it is quite a flexible system as well. And the other kind of funds, and I think that's the next slide, is more about what can be done under the Secretariat itself, as was done in the past, for example, with the Japanese fund. So all of these possibilities have been discussed based on the information we had available, which was unfortunately not complete. And rather than having a choice made on what kind of fund would be the best, we decided as a group that it is very important for the COP then to look at the criteria and hopefully have more information on the funds by then. But if I can ask you to go to the next slide. Yeah. So based on the discussions we had and the input we received from the funds and the DSI co-chairs also who were present, we came to some recommendations, and those recommendations have been sent to the COP to be taken on board under the agenda item on DSI. And those recommendations are based on the discussions we had. but we do recommend that you also look at the report to have a better idea of how the criteria can be applied by different potential funds. But I would like to come back to the fact that what Patrick also said, that form should follow function. So any fund host should be determined by what COP will decide that a fund will need to do. And that COP will decide on how the multilateral mechanism will function and will generate the revenue and send it to a fund and disperse it. So that is priority. Once the functions are clear, then it is possible to identify what would be the best host. And I said there was no consensual recommendation on which entity, but we do think that the discussion at least increased very much our understanding of how the DSI, what the DSI process would need in a fund and what will have to be further elaborated on. So with this, I would like to very much thank also the people from the ACRM and the Secretariat and the co-chairs for helping us guide us through this discussion, which was a very tough one. I mean, you guys have been dealing with this for years. We hadn't, but it was a very, very interesting exercise. And with this, I would like to give the floor back to, I think, to the DSI coaches. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ines and Patrick, for that detailed presentation, highlighting what was discussed at the ACRM and how it informs the discussion under the DSI as we continue to find potential solutions with regards to this area on the fund host, but also most especially, like you have said, form following function. I think the ACRM was also very crucial in terms of looking through the criteria that was available and what would be required to be done by any fund that would be identified. And therefore, I think these recommendations that are being forwarded for consideration at COP will be very, very useful in addressing this area. So thank you very, very much. I think maybe the participants today are itching to maybe respond to some of the issues that have been raised, but also maybe seek areas for clarification. So I hope that everyone here found it as useful as we have. And I know that in a few weeks' time, we'll all need to be digesting this further in a more face-to-face kind of discussion. So at this moment, we can open the floor for Q&A. So maybe just indicate by raising of hands, as well as introducing yourself a bit, and then you can raise any questions. I think Patrick, Ines are here, William, myself, and the Secretariat will all be able to address any questions, but also any points of discussions based on the presentations made. So let me check. I don't see any hands yet. Maybe the Secretariat can help.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't see any either. There was a few that were raised a minute ago, but they've gone back down again. But Usman has his hand up and has just gone back down again. Yeah, we don't have any at the moment.
All right. So we do now. We have Sunil. Please have the floor.
Thank you very much. Nice presentation. In fact, all the three in the series have been nice. My name is Sunil Archak. I'm from India. I'm co-chair of the enhancement of the multilateral system in the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources. So I'm very keenly following all the developments that are happening here. And then we had fun discussions with you guys also. Now, yes, everything has been, it's very well understood that the path you are taking to just to achieve the goals, $1 million question that everybody is looking at, has that been looked at by this particular committee or the OCRM? The rates whether that is part of the deliberations and discussions so far in any of these rates, which is right now as X% or Y%, and how does it affect the decision making or providing more options for parties to, let's say, identify and have a little more informed decision making. Thank you.
Thank you. I see, Ines, you were already shaking your head. Maybe you have.
Yes, thank you, Patso. And thank you for the question. In fact, we stayed very far from any of the substantive discussions at DSI. So we did not look at any of the items that were being discussed in the DSI. That wasn't easy because people were looking at how would it work, the percentage or the disbursement, whether it would be a good idea or not to do it directly or not directly, etc. So to us, it was very important. We very much appreciated that the DSI working group did not discuss the fund, which was much appreciated. And we tried to return the favor or the courtesy by staying away from content. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, then I think Will, you want to come in, and because this was discussed under the DSI discussion, so maybe you might just reflect on that, Will. I'll hand over to my co-chair. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, and hi Sunil. Look at this, all these co-chairs. Isn't this brilliant? It's great to hear from you, Sunil. So that's right. Inez and Patrick and the ACRM did a good job of not landing on that. I guess the thing that we that the ACRM did talk about was the diversity of people who might be paying, right? And the fact that they might be located all around the world. They might be very different kinds of size. They might be contributing very different amounts of money at different points in the year, and you know, there was a really lively discussion about that, and I think you know, the co-chairs presented some of that. I also think as well that the co-chairs did a good job, the ACRM co-chairs did a good job of making clear that the amount of funding coming in could be quite different. There were quite different conceptions about what the size of financial flows could be. And so sort of asking the potential fund hosts, you know, could you deal with lots of small amounts of money or, you know, lots of big amounts of money and all those different varieties. So again, that's all covered in the report. So not specifically on the rate question, no, but on all the things but the rate question, I think we've got a great recommendation, you know, at least a great report, I think, in that document. Thanks, Sunil.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Will. I don't seem to see any more hands requesting for the floor. I do now. Pierre, please go ahead. Pierre, you can have the floor.
Yeah, okay. Yes, thank you very much. So can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I have a question about the impressions of the co-chairs of the Resource Mobilization Advisory Committee on the ability of the DSI fund, whatever the DSI fund turns out to be in the end, to act as a stepping stone to the new independent fund that the developing countries in the CBD have been asking for 30 years, which is foreseen in Article 21 as well. A fund that will be under the control and authority of the COP. Now, I know that in Montreal, we agreed that the GBFF will play that role until 2030. So we'll probably be talking about a revision to that sometime soon. But do you think that this DSI fund could act as a stepping stone? Could be a first example of how a fund under the authority and control of the COP might function, and could then provide models and lessons for the discussion that we will undoubtedly have about the independent fund in future COPs. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Patrick, you want to have this one. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mphatso, and thanks, Pierre, for the question or perhaps even the provocation. I think what I would say is that in the ACRM, when we were taking a look at the global finance landscape, so in part 2 of our mandate, we develop in Annex 3 of our recommendations there a list of criteria that, in all honesty, still bracketed and to be discussed at the COP, of potential criteria that a fund to support developing countries in the implementation of the convention would need to have. And many of those criteria are familiar or relate to the criteria that we have identified as also needed for the DSI fund. So there is some sort of I wouldn't say correlation, but proximity between these two criteria sets. But another point that I also wanted to flag, and has been an important part of the conversation as well, is that we need to also bear in mind that the money that is coming from DSI has a different legal nature than official development assistance. That is, of course, coming from the benefit sharing areas of the convention, and not under Article 20 or 21 of the convention, where this other historic idea of a fund for developing countries has been coming from. So, of course, in the end of the day, both the money that is coming through ODA to developing countries and the revenue to be generated by DSI, they translate into money, right? They are ultimately their financial resources, but they are coming from different articles of the convention. So they have different sets of legal obligations around them. So there is also that element to be borne in mind. So I will not reply to your provocation in more in depth than this, but I would just flag out that there are some elements of proximity and there are some elements of separation between the two ideas.
Thank you, Patrick, for that response. I hope it addresses Pierre's question. And I really don't see any more requests for the floor at this moment, which is perhaps good. I know people are getting ready to prepare for COP, and maybe we can leave early today and give you time to go through the report of the ACRM, which has more details of what was presented. And I think maybe you can look for more information there. I see we have Amber. Amber, go ahead. Amber, I think there's a hand from Amber. Please unmute yourself and we are ready to get your question.
Sorry, I'm on public transportation. I'm trying to follow the conversation and I might have just really missed it. So I really do apologize. And I hope, Prato, you'll forgive me for asking the dumb questions, but I kind of missed what the MPTF is. Could you come back on that for me? Sorry for the background noise. And help me out there just so that I can fill in the gaps.
So I think Amber's question is on the MPTF and what it is about. I think maybe there is more clarity on what the JEF is. So maybe, I think, Ines, you made that presentation. If you could just come again, maybe to give a background of what is the MPTF and maybe why was it part of our discussion. I think maybe that would help Amber's need for clarification. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And indeed, I went through it quite quickly because it's quite a lot of different things and we're used to working with acronyms and we think everybody knows those. So apologies for that. It's the multi-partner trust funds, which are administered by UNDP. And it is basically many different kinds of funds that can be established. From what I understood, if I remember correctly, is that whenever there are two UN organizations with other actors that are hosting a fund, they can do this through the multi-partner trust fund. So it's a way of establishing funds that can then serve multiple purposes. The advantage of the MPTF is basically that it is UN. It has all the criteria, all the legal checks and balances that would otherwise be needed to put in place if you develop a fund outside of a UN system. So it's not UNDP, but it's UNDP administered, but they can be hosted by any two UN organizations. I would be tempted to ask David to give more information on this one, or Will. We got a lot of information from the office itself during the ACRM meeting, but it doesn't say much about the MPTF itself, what I just read on the slide. So I don't know, Will, you want to take it, or David?
Yeah, I think maybe Will, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Mphatso. No, so I mean, you know, Inez, dear co-chair, I thought that was a good explanation, and thanks for the question as well. I mean, it's an office under the UN that administers and manages funds that can sort of address a huge number of different things, right? So the idea is that it's a part of the UN that can very quickly and at scale, you know, deliver funds so that funding can be mobilized for, you know, pressing kind of challenges. So, I mean, I've been looking at this recently in preparation for this webinar. So it administers 268 funds. 15 of those funds feature private sector operators. The MPTF works with 66 implementing UN agencies in 143 countries and manages a portfolio of over $19 billion US. I mean, I think for our purposes, what's important is that the Kunming Biodiversity Fund, which was generously supported by the government of China, you'll remember at COP 15.1, the Kunming Biodiversity Fund has been set up as a sort of one of these partnerships between the CBD Secretariat and the multi-partner trust funds. So both sort of organizations have got experience of working with each other. There's lots more information in the report from the ACRM3 meeting, because we were lucky enough to hear from the multi-partner trust fund at that meeting. So do look at that information if you haven't already. But at a very high level, I think effectively what happens is that, you know, we as a COP would agree a terms of reference for the way this fund could or might work. We would pass that terms of reference to the multi-partner trust fund, and within the kind of arrangements that they have and within the requirements, you know, that they have, and there's more discussion on those in the slides and in the document, but within those constraints, they would go ahead and deliver what the COP asks them to do. So it's another option on the table, in addition to the GEF and the standalone fund that we heard about earlier. Thanks, Mphatso.
Yeah, thanks, Will, as well as Ines. I really hope this addresses Amber's question and those maybe that have been asking themselves, what is the multi-partner trust fund? It's one of the options on the table, and it was presented to us as we try to find out potential hosts that would host this fund. So thank you for those answers. I'm trying to check to see if there are any more hands that have come up. There is one more from Ling. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mphatso. Thank you also to the co-chairs of both the DSI Working Group and ACRM for your presentations and interventions. One question I had, I mean, obviously something that came out of DSI Working Group 2 was that the one of the options as a criteria for disbursement, option B, that parties are looking at is with regard to direct allocation to countries. Now, and you know, obviously from the discussions at the ACRM and the report of the meeting, this is something that Jeff, in its presentations to the committee, also said as much, that it doesn't consider itself a viable entity to be able to use that mode of disbursement at the moment. Although, of course, there was a lot of discussion around this and perhaps differences in opinions. I wonder if you had any further thoughts on that, because it would seem to me that being able to narrow the options in front of parties when we get to COP would be very important, and to be able to kind of make the right decisions going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lim. And I don't know if any of the SCRM co-chairs want to respond to what Lim might have indicated that she heard from Jeff. I see Ines. Ines, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for the question. I think that goes back to what Patrick also said at the start and that I repeated, and that is form needs to follow function. We do not believe that COP should be limited in its choices regarding the functioning of the multilateral mechanism by the kind of host that could eventually be chosen to function as a DSI fund. You're right that in the explanations by the GEF, and as is written in the report, some of the criteria will be easier to comply with by the GEF and the GBFF as it is now. Some of the criteria they will be able to adjust to. Even if they don't do it now, they would be able to accommodate them. Some of the criteria will be very difficult. For example, the direct allocation, as you say. So, and it is true that the GEF itself was doubtful whether they would be the best organization then to be hosting if the COP would choose that as a final decision on the disbursement. But again, it is our firm belief as co-chairs that the COP should not be limited by the funds that may or may not comply with or accommodate the criteria. It's really the other way around. I think COP will need to make a decision that is the best for the DSI mechanism, and then based on that, make the choice on the fund, not the other way around. Because then I think we wouldn't be doing ourselves any favors, and we may actually jeopardize the optimal functioning of this mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines. I think you have said it all for all of us. I think this is also the thinking that we have as co-chairs of the DSI, that the form should follow function. I think this is the spirit under which the SCRM discussions also were held. And we hope that this is what is going to guide the choice of a host at the end, and not to bring out limitations. And we are just happy also that we do have a number of options to consider and look at what is expected for any suitable host to deliver. And that should always be at the back of our mind for any choice that will be made, looking at what is expected to be delivered in terms of what is expected out of this fund. So thank you very much. I don't really see any more hands at the moment. And I think, like I had said earlier, it would be great for to release everyone and go through the SCRM report. It has got really detailed information on what was discussed and what each potential host presented would be the things that they would be able to provide if they were in the position to host this fund. And I think this is important to guide us as we prepare for COP. And so just to say thank you very much to the SCRM co-chairs for making yourselves available and providing this information. And also on behalf of my co-chair, to say that we really wanted to have this DSI webinar series just to provide a little bit more information as people prepare for COP. And we hope that the 3 sessions we've had, you have found them very useful to look at those issues that were really outstanding, and we needed additional information in order to help us to prepare. And as it was noted in the previous working group, I will not be in attendance at the COP in a few weeks' time, so I do not have the burden of over-preparing like everyone else, but I'll be happy to continue supporting the process. However, I just want to give my personal thanks to the government of South Africa for agreeing that Lactatia could help to facilitate discussions on DSI at the COP. So we are happy with this agreement, and hopefully that you continue to work with Lactatia the way you've been working with me in a cooperative spirit, as well as we have had. And looking forward to a fruitful outcome on my side. I'll be checking on the online forums to see how the DSI discussion is progressing, and very optimistic that something good will come up out of the COP. So on my side, I wish you all a safe journey to COP and look forward to the outcomes that you will reach whilst there. I don't know if you have any final words as we close this series. I'll hand over to you, but that's what I can say from my side. Thank you.
Any final words? Sounds very ominous, doesn't it? Huge thanks to Mphatso, as always. You heard me on that at the second working group, so I won't make us all unhappy again and make us all sad. But huge thanks to Mphatso. We'll miss you dearly at COP. Massive thanks to the ACRM co-chairs. Thanks to the Secretariat for organising this series. It's been a lot of work in a short amount of time. Thanks to you all. We'll see you soon. Travel safe, think hard, prepare well, and let's get ready for a really good few weeks. Bye, everyone.